if you listen to the show last week, I take the approach, I do these shows and I just assume everybody in the world listens to them. I spoke with Lawrence Kraus, theoretical physicist and author of the upcoming book, The Physics of Climate Change. But this would be the first time that I've done the same topic in back-to-back weeks. This is such a fiery issue. We have a new president who's making climate a priority, so I wanted to get another perspective. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Barnard Cohen. He is a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, where he concentrates on energy, natural resources, and international relations. Barnard, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, and I'm glad to be here.
I'd like to start with your high-level view of the climate issue. I think it's important to break the issue down into three segments because you can believe in one and not the other, and people get labeled. So I want to look at it from a standpoint of, is there a crisis? Is it man-made? And is that crisis, if it exists, existential? What are your thoughts?
Okay, is there a crisis? If you look at the climatological history of the Earth, and that goes back a long way, about 4.5 billion years, you will see that in that extremely lengthy period of time, the Earth has been through many climate changes. The term climate change is actually somewhat redundant because climates always change. We have had periods when there have been absolutely no ice caps on either the North Pole or the South Pole, and we have had periods when the entire Earth was covered with snow. That was called snowball Earth. That's just to put things in perspective. Our planet is used to extremes. It has gone through them before. Now, let's jump up to more modern times, and let's ask ourselves, are we seeing anything today that we have not seen before? And I think the answer to that is no. We have been, over the course of the last 2 million years, we have been through 17 ice ages, some of them severe, some of them smaller, which means, however, that on 17 different occasions, the planet cooled off enough so that gigantic ice sheets forming in the North Pole moved south, as far south as Kentucky in the North American continent, and as on 17 different occasions, those ice sheets melted. All of that took place without any human input whatsoever. That was simply Mother Nature doing her thing. The last small ice age we went through was something called the Little Ice Age, and it existed from about 1300 to around 1750 to 1850. And we are now still in the process of emerging from that Little Ice Age. So the slight warming that we have seen over the course of the last 250 years or so has been in reaction to or a recovery from an extended period of cooling. And if you look at just the history of climatology over the past several thousand years, you'll see that temperatures go up, they go down. Quite frankly, we don't know the reasons why. There are all sorts of fascinating theories as to what brings that about. But change is the norm. And so if you look at what we're looking at today, quite frankly, I would argue that we are in an interglacial period, which means we are living, and we're fortunate in this regard, we are living between the last ice age and the next one. And so is there a climate crisis? Well, I would say today, no. Tomorrow, and we don't know how to define tomorrow, but yes, there will be one when the Earth starts to cool back down again, or which geological history tells us it most certainly will. Right. So that, in a nutshell, is a bit of perspective on the climate. It's a fascinating subject. We see all sorts of extremes within that. We have had droughts. We have had floods. And by the way, we will continue to have them. But if you look at the temperature, if you look at the temperature record today and what is going on, has there been an increase in both the number and intensity of hurricane activity? The answer is no. Has there been an increase in tornadic activity? No. In fact, for reasons, quite frankly, we don't understand. But tornado activity has actually decreased. Has there been a rise in sea level? Well, yes, but we have to put an asterisk next to that because that rise actually began around 18,000 years ago when the last great ice age, the geological term that's known as the Pleistocene, started coming to an end, for which, by the way, we can be eternally grateful. But the rise of sea level is now decelerating as we get further away from the last ice age in time. So we have to be very careful when we look at things and say, well, this is being caused by this, or this is being caused by carbon dioxide, or what have you. There are all sorts of things in play here.
Okay, I want to stop you there. I know I gave you 3 ways I want to break it up, but, I want to put context because, you went from an expert on the environmental issues and a theoretical physicist. So us laymen down here, let's tie this stuff together. So in theory, you're saying, obviously, there is climate change because you both agree that there's climate change. The nuance to the way it's described is that they're saying that this is something new. And you're saying, of course, trying to put me in a trick bag by forcing me to say yes, because it's always been. So, of course, the answer is yes, which is why I think it's a problem, whatever you believe, when you make it black and white. So, you get people who say the climate's changing, and once they get you to say yes, they're like, see, which will get you that whole 97% thing people talk about. So they say yes, but they're like, but wait a minute, I said more, and you're not adding on my explanation, which is important. So you're saying yes because it's what the climate does, and they're saying yes. So what do you say to them who say, before we get to whether it's man-made, what do you say to them? Say that, okay, I agree with you that it's been happening, but I believe that in the last, they usually use 1950 in that area as a big jump-off point. When they say starting then, that change accelerated greatly. So what do you say to that point?
To that point, I would say look at the temperature record, and you will find that the warmest decade in the 20th century was actually the decade of the 1930s. And that was followed by a cooling off that actually started in the 1940s and lasted throughout the 1970s. Had you picked up a copy of Time magazine or Newsweek magazine in the mid-1970s, you would have seen front-page stories about the coming ice age. Why? Because we had had some very severe weather, particularly in North America. We had had massive crop losses of citrus fruits in Florida. And the conventional wisdom at the time was that we were headed into an ice age. Then, lo and behold, things warmed up a bit. We recovered from that cooling, went into a warming, and we have been kind of stuck in neutral now for that last 20 or 25 years. So I'm afraid that climatological record simply does not substantiate the claim that we are undergoing continuing warming when the warmest decade of the last century was the decade of the 1930s.
Right, and that is 20 years before they say that
that's exactly. It's important to bear in mind from a scientific perspective. In cause and effect relationships, the cause has to precede the effect. And so, if we are told that greenhouse gas emissions are artificially warming the climate, then how do you explain the warming that took place before those emissions started rising? So it's something that deserves everyone's attention, and a lot of things can appear to explain things that in fact don't.
Yes, hold that thought, and we'll get to the other two sections of my question on the other side. More with Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center of Public Policy Research. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Can't remember her name.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing environmental issues with Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Before the break, Bonner was addressing my three-part questions on climate change. It was, is there a crisis? Is it man-made? And is it existential? Technically, he answered the third one already. And we were almost done with the first one, but you say that there's no crisis now, but there may be in the future. So why do we keep hearing that there is a consensus on climate change and that the science is settled?
Yes, this word consensus and the phrase the science is settled, we have to be very careful with that. I would argue that in the world of science, the science isn't settled on much of anything. Science is an ongoing inquiry. What we think we know today is going to be overtaken by what we know tomorrow. So I would argue that the whole notion that there is a consensus is actually a rhetorical tool used by climate alarmists to shut off any and all debate about the issue. If, after all, there is a consensus, then what we need then to do is move on to a solution. But what if A, there is no consensus, and B, if those purporting to say that there is a consensus have an agenda in mind, which I would argue has absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with the climate. And here is where we get into why is this agenda being pushed? What is the ultimate goal? Why are we talking about this? Climate in and of itself is a fascinating subject. But once the proposition has been put forward that this is a crisis that needs to be addressed urgently, then we have to wonder, well, what means are going to be adopted to address this crisis, and what are the implications of that? How is that going to affect ordinary people? If we accept the conventional narrative, in this case, that man-made emissions of greenhouse gases brought about through the burning of fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and natural gas, are artificially warming the climate to such a degree that we must take drastic measures to curtail those emissions, lower the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which means that we need to transform rather radically those segments of our society that are subject to energy. And of course, energy is the lifeblood of all of society. And without energy, this program would not be taking place, and a lot of other things that we do in our daily lives would be drastically changed. So let's just bear that in mind. I would also argue, be careful with that word consensus. In the summer of 1914, there was a consensus among European leaders that they should have a war. Well, how did that turn out? And we want to make sure that we don't go down the same road, as I fear we will, because what is being advocated is that on the basis of nothing other than a theory, by the way, the theory of carbon dioxide driving climate, that's actually nothing new. It's been around since the mid-19th century. It originated in Germany and the Austrian part of the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It languished in relative obscurity until it was picked up around 30 or 40 years ago, and now is serving as the basis and the explanation for why drastic measures need to be taken. We need to do away with fossil fuels and replace those initially with renewable energy, meaning primarily wind and solar. And let's bear something in mind here. You cannot replace our fossil fuel-driven energy sector with intermittent wind and solar. It
Not for 7.5 billion people.
That's right. Furthermore, I would argue, from a purely moral standpoint, if we suppress levels of carbon dioxide, as has been put forward, including by your previous guest, Mr. Kraus. Now, listen to that. He seems like a very reasonable man, but I think he ignores a few things. If you suppress carbon dioxide levels globally, what is going to happen? You are going to lower agricultural productivity. CO2 is plant food. We have close to 8 billion people on the planet, and they're going to have to be fed. And many of those people reside in poorer countries. And if you go after carbon dioxide and you take that level back to where it was 250 years ago at the end of the Little Ice Age, the result will be mass famine. That is a real crisis. That is something that will really happen, and it will have been man-made as a result of policies adopted ostensibly to combat climate change, which, in fact, will make the Earth a much less safe and much less prosperous place to live in.
Okay, let me jump in there because you gave me a lot that I want to cover. So I don't know. I think I'm going to go with the last thing and go back to the other thing. So to that point about the agriculture, they are a wily bunch, and I will give them credit that I hear a lot of people on the climate side say now that they understand that, and they give a carve out. And you study this more than me, so I'm sure you've heard this. Well, we know we got there because of this, but we're there now, and we're a thriving first world country. So we need to rein ours in, but we need to allow India and China and other third world countries to use fossil fuels and do their thing until they catch up. So that's the way they got to address that for one. And you can mention something about that after I finish. But the other thing is, you mentioned why would they do this, and you say that they're trying to take drastic measures. And I approach this like I do everything because I study everything a little bit so I understand it, but, it's not what my, main understanding is. So I can agree and disagree a little with any size. So, and read up more and things of that nature. But I will say I get concerned when people go to the extremes of anything. And I find that in everything. We talk about race relations, we talk about income and everything. When they go to extremes, they do, and I think they have good intentions, but they do more harm than good. And you mentioned something about be careful of the consensus. Well, I want to be careful of settled science, because is it really settled? We're not talking about 1 + 1. We're talking about something that even if they're right, that there's an issue, that there's a lot of factors that go into it. So to say it's settled seems extreme. And we must remember, so they attack, people on one side, but we must remember that they've been given these predictions for years. I mentioned to Lawrence Kraus about that. It's like, whether you're right or not, you have an uphill battle because of the people who've been saying for years, we'll be dead in 5 years, we'll be dead in 10 years. But we're forgetting that, they said that over the years that temperature was going to rise over 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. It didn't happen. They talked about global emissions. They talked about there'd be no snow on Mount Kilimanjaro, which didn't happen. They keep talking about this stuff that doesn't happen, and that hurts their cause. So I don't know why they do it. Obviously, you would know better than I. But for a layman like me, we don't know whether they're right or wrong, but we do know that, it's catastrophic for you to make these extreme things to put people in a fear situation and then say, because of that, we need to shut everything down tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail right on the head. When you say that they're really stressing fear, they're trying to scare us to death. They're trying to scare us to death so that we take measures which are manifestly contrary to our own interests. if you can make the case, convince enough people that we are facing a crisis and that urgent action needs to be taken. Otherwise, all sorts of climate catastrophes will take place, from wildfires in the West, the rising sea levels, to what have you. This is a rhetorical tool. Now, you're quite right. This may ultimately be counterproductive because they have predicted one disaster after the other that demonstrably has not taken place. And if there have been...
We'll just hold that thought. We can finish it on the other side and get to the policies that's hurting. More with Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Nothing else matters.
Now, more of the Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing environmental issues with Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. And Bonner, please finish your point on fear-mongering.
It's a key element of the alarmist approach to the subject to scare us into doing things we otherwise would not do. And it's a tactic that has been used before in other areas of the world on other issues, but it is really the centerpiece of the whole climate alarmist approach. We are in as Al Gore has referred to it, a climate emergency or planetary emergency, and one that requires urgent action now. Well, it's that urgent action that we should be very leery of, because that urgent action, all done in the name of combating a crisis that, in my view, demonstrably does not exist, that will take us down a road that will be extremely harmful, particularly for the most vulnerable in our society.
I'd like to put a point on that here. When I respond to stuff on social media and stuff, I try not to argue people. I just try to say, okay, I'll give you your point. But so they were talking about some of Biden's executive orders, which we'll get to. And I say, all right, I get your point. But talking about Keystone Pipeline, I believe. And I said, but we're not there yet. Renewables can't cover what we need. And we're at least 10, 15 years away. So what are these people supposed to do now? Say you're in your 50s and you're close to retirement. Can't you work on renewables if you want to? But these people have their livelihood and be able to retire. And this person responded, these are sacred lands, and I don't care about the black snake. We need to preserve the earth. The people do not own the earth owns us. So this is the mindset of people. And then there's another one who says that people on your side say that you just don't, we can't have this immediate change, and we're living the best lives we've ever lived in history. So why be so drastic? But their argument is, but similarly, hollow arguments, these are the same as those we used in the past to delay ending slavery, granting the women right to vote, ending colonial rule, ending segregation, all these type of things. So they're basically equating you saying it's not an existential threat to not wanting to end slavery. So this is the way they talk. So it makes it hard to take them seriously. But I do want to say, you mentioned climate alarmists a couple of times, and I want to say that, so we hear this alarmist and they call you denier, but aren't those terms kind of deceptive in the sense that most people are somewhere in the middle? And if that's the case, aren't both sides of that argument of the people who study this losing the public with their messaging?
That's an interesting question that you raised, but for all the hue and cry that we hear about this subject, when Americans are asked what their priorities are, what things they really think about. Now, that's everything, depending on when the question is being asked, health care, unemployment. Today, of course, obviously, COVID-19. You can go down the list. What comes in dead last, invariably, from one survey to another, is climate change. Mm-hmm. For all the rhetoric that has been spilled and all the money that has been spent, average Americans have never bought into the whole notion that their activities are contributing to a potentially catastrophic warming of the planet. But that is not the case with the political class, which is now, through the Biden administration, absolutely determined to take measures pushing the U.S. through a very dramatic energy transformation, one which, as you pointed out, is going to leave us dangerously dependent on intermittent wind and solar power, which we know for a fact has absolutely no possibility whatsoever of replacing fossil fuels. Something else is going to have to come along, and we don't know what that something else is or when it does. If you want to look to the future of the United States, look no further than California, where California has ahead of everyone else taken measures to address what it would have us believe is climate change, with the result that it has an extraordinary dependence on wind and solar, with the very predictable result of rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts, shortages of electricity, not brought about by climate change whatsoever, but brought about by policies to address climate change.
That is a great point.
President Biden has already said California is our model. Well, look out Illinois, look out Wisconsin, look out Arkansas, look out wherever you are, because California is coming to you, and you're not going to like what you see.
Well, for the rest of this interview, we're going to talk about Biden and talk about the things he wants to do and how it would affect us. But I do want to point out, we've mentioned my interview with Lawrence Kraus a couple of times, and I do want to give him credit because unlike these fear mongers you're talking about, he did not say we were going to die tomorrow. He did not say that we were ready with renewables. He did not poo-poo nuclear. And I think it's an important approach, at least, to talk about that. So coming up, we'll talk about Biden and his executive orders. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are continuing our discussion of the environment with Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at National Center for Public Policy Research. And now I want to shift to the Biden administration. I approached this topic like I do all of them, logic and focusing on solutions, and I'm willing to listen to anything that makes sense. But this ties to especially the insane number of executive orders we've seen recently. My issue with the administrative state, and I had a friend of mine asked me, it's like, did you say the same thing when Trump was president? It's like, it's funny. That's the wonderful thing about the internet. Here's an article I wrote 3 weeks after he was inaugurated saying that we have abdicated our responsibility, at least Congress has, and we let these presidents just do whatever they want, and it becomes a problem. So now Biden is writing an executive order to do whatever he wants to do. I'm sure there'll be challenges down the road, but the question here is, does it make sense? Will it work? We know it won't. In many cases, most of it doesn't even have any teeth. And how will it affect the everyday Americans? I talked about the tweet of the woman saying stopping the Keystone Pipeline is good. Who cares about the 11,000 jobs? But what are your thoughts? Let's start with that one, Bonner, on the Keystone Pipeline.
Yeah, for our listeners, Keystone Pipeline would transmit oil from northeastern I'm drawing a blank.
For Canada?
It's in Canada. It would transport Canadian oil down through North Dakota, tying up to a existing pipeline structure in Nebraska before it's then forwarded to the Gulf of Mexico to be refined. Biden has effectively killed that. And with the result that not only that thousands and thousands of jobs will be lost, both constructing the pipeline and eventually refining the oil, what you're really seeing here is an assault on the infrastructure of fossil fuels, that if you destroy the infrastructure and you make it difficult to impossible to transmit that oil and natural gas, then that will eventually dry up, particularly when you combine that with what Biden also has done with an executive order, namely put an end for the next 60 days to all oil and gas exploration on federal land, most of which is located out west. Well, you can rest assured that once that 60 days has passed, that will be extended from now until kingdom come. Well, we derive 9% of our oil and natural gas from federal land. So if you artificially suppress the supply and you attack and begin the dismantling of the infrastructure necessary to distribute that oil and natural gas, then you are going to tilt the playing field away from fossil fuels in favor of the aforementioned renewables, wind and solar, with tremendous consequences for everyone. One of the more interesting comments and more revealing comments was made by the designated Secretary of Energy for Mr. Biden, and who the former governor of Michigan, Ms. Granholm, who said that, yes, there would be sacrifices. Well, I can assure you that Secretary Granholm will not be making those sacrifices, and neither will anybody else in the political ruling class. Those sacrifices will not only be made by the workers who will lose their jobs, but by ordinary Americans whose disposable incomes will sink precipitously once their source of energy goes from reliable and affordable fossil fuels to unreliable and unaffordable wind and solar. This transformation will, in fact, be wrenching, and it's going to put the United States at a tremendous geostrategic disadvantage vis-a-vis China. The U.S. right now is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. We were able to break the OPEC monopoly on that, so we are no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil for our transportation fuel and for the fuel that we use to warm our homes in winter and cool them in summer. And what has the Biden administration done? It is throwing all of that out the window and is once again switching that dependence from the Middle East, this time to China, because China, it turns out, is the chief supplier of the rare earths and other metals that go into both wind turbines and solar panels. So we're simply switching one dependency that we had gotten rid of now for another one to our chief geopolitical rival. This makes absolutely no sense.
And let me stop you there. You started off this by trying to, educate the listeners on the Keystone Pipeline, but it's important for them to know a couple things. One, that Keystone is Keystone XL because the average people aren't following this. That Keystone, the pipeline, the original one, is already built and already pumping oil. So it's not like you're cheering if you're a climate change person, like this is going away, like there's not still oil there. That's true. But beyond that, changing the dependency doesn't mean we won't use fossil fuels. It just means we have to get it from someone else if we don't have enough. And lastly, you read the quote from his designate for the energy secretary. But here's one, too, a voice of someone who said that the pipeline is neither the silver bullet for the economy nor the express lane to climate disaster, and that saying that this is being overplayed as a problem. And that was Barack Obama when he said no to the Keystone XL pipeline. Coming up, more on the Biden administration with Bonner Cohen. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
That's true. You like me and I like you.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back to the show. We are discussing the environment and Biden's executive orders with Bonner Cohen, and we talked about the Keystone Pipeline And now I want to talk about his executive order rejoining the Paris Accord. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. This, I think, it will be a terrible decision by the Biden administration, but one which I think was absolutely predictable. What we will do is we will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. Now, we call it an accord when, in fact, it is a treaty, but the Biden administration, the Obama administration, knowing full well that the Senate would never approve such an agreement, rebranded it as an accord and circumvented the U.S. Constitution in the process. And now we're going to find ourselves obligated to reducing what is referred to as our carbon footprint. And we are going to be making reductions, considerable reductions in our use of energy under the terms of an agreement never ratified by the U.S. Senate, and under terms of an agreement which allows China to do practically nothing, even though China's emissions of greenhouse gases far exceed ours, as do those of India. And we will see American companies subject to all sorts of legal challenges, for instance, manufacturing facilities, putting out emissions. Well, what if an environmental group comes along and says those emissions are in violation of an international agreement, and those companies are going to be hauled off to court. This is how this particular game is played, and what we're going to see is ourselves put on the receiving end of an agreement that was specifically designed to undermine U.S. productivity of oil and natural gas, which is precisely why the Obama administration went along with it.
Let me interrupt you there, though. I hate to be too optimistic. I don't want to be, but isn't it true? And I agree with that, but isn't it true really to all those people on the climate side who are dancing and celebrating and throwing confetti that this doesn't really have any teeth, right? There's no, obviously, as long as you're in control, you can push things. That's the problem for sure. But the accord itself just says, hey, we like to do what we can to keep it here. And if we missed the mark, oh, well, we missed the mark, right?
Right. Within the agreement itself, there are no enforcement mechanisms. So nobody can make us do anything. But the way the American system works is once you have the U.S., quote unquote, committed to do X, Y, and Z, and certain people determine that you are not doing X, Y, and Z, you are going to be sued. And the companies that find themselves on the receiving end of those lawsuits, and their employees and the people they serve are ultimately going to pay the price for this. So yes, the agreement itself has no teeth, but within the context of a country that is committed to do this, you just watch the lawsuits come, and come they will.
Yeah, so it sounds like as we summarize, we got a minute here. Time flies. It's been great. But it seems like we are willing, like the extremists say, we are willing to make these extreme moves to mitigate something that many of them will admit that we have very little control over, even if it is as bad as they say. Giving them their argument, we're going to end, but none of them want to give up their iPhones. None of them want to turn the heat off. None of them want to stop doing all these other things. So I guess we'll have to sit back and see what happens. But I don't think they truly either understand or willing to do the things that they think they need to do. This has been insightful. It's good to hear the other side of both. Go back and listen to last week for those of you who disagree. And I think it's great. He is Bonner Cohen, Senior Fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. Bonner, thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed it.